We are amidst strange beings in a strange land. Take this.
Since my childhood, those words rang with the sound of adventure. It's dangerous to go alone. Take this. The concept of a single brave boy and his trusty sword against all the monsters wrought on the kingdom of Hyrule was a harrowing tale. Of course, the game's impact goes much further than its storytelling. This game was the granddaddy of action-adventure gaming that passed down its methodology to thousands of games over the last few decades. But every generation, we see another game in this legendary series steal the limelight and share a new innovation with the gaming world that often advances the medium by leaps and bounds. Of the many things this series has revolutionized over the decades, at the forefront of my memory are the bosses. It's not a stretch to say that I am the boss fanatic I am today, in big part thanks to this franchise. I remember when I was a little boy, barely old enough to hold that nostalgic rectangular controller, and I watched a friend's older brother take on intimidating behemoths in epic duels or even creative ways that required clever thought. It's one of those memories I will never forget. So today, I want to embark on a new journey together with you to rank all the bosses in the Legend of Zelda franchise from worst to best. I briefly considered ranking all the bosses in a giant overarching list just like I did with Souls, but I quickly realized that the Zelda games have differentiated so much over the years that they're really difficult to compare. On the whole, Zelda bosses tend to lean more toward having puzzle mechanics to conquer rather than having raw combat prowess be measured. Sure, you need to be able to dodge effectively and know when and how to strike, but unlike Dark Souls where you get into a rhythm of dodge, hit, heal when needed, repeat until dead, the Zelda franchise leans more toward a handful of scripted attacks or sequences with an underlying puzzle mechanic. It has its own rhythm, so to speak, and it varies greatly from boss to boss and game to game. Other bosses are straight up combat duels, and the vast majority blends somewhere in between. So instead of doing one major overarching list of bosses, we'll take each video game by game. The beauty of going through the series in this manner is that we'll get to see how bosses evolve over time between those puzzle-focused, combat-focused, or somewhere in between designs. Today we'll be kicking things off with the game that started it all 33 years ago on the Nintendo Entertainment System, The Legend of Zelda. I'm sure it goes without saying, but keep in mind that the puzzle and combat mechanics are archaic due to this game's age, and they lack the complexity that we'll see in some of the later games. That said, I believe that one of the strengths of some of the best Zelda bosses is that there's beauty in their simplicity. Or to say it a different way, a boss doesn't need to be complicated to deliver a satisfying experience. With all of that said, let's get started with the Legend of Zelda bosses ranked from worst to best. Number 7, Digged Auger. This floating anus is about as worthwhile as that descriptor. If you're like me, then you fully explore each dungeon before proceeding to its boss. If you do, you'll find an old man saying Digged Auger hates a certain kind of sound. I wonder if it has anything to do with the recorder we found in this exact dungeon. And that's where I'll give it one piece of credit. This boss is a prototype for what many bosses later in the series become, a puzzle fight centered around a dungeon item. Those fights are typically awesome as long as they have creative and enjoyable mechanics behind them. I would even argue that it adds to the overall quality of the game's bosses altogether because designing fights separately around individual items gives a different focal point for their battles. Digged Auger, on the other hand, takes the recorder like a flat note and deflates to a miniature butthole. His only way of hurting you is to bump directly into you, so to make this fight have any stakes at all, he requires the assistance of the surrounding statues to shoot fireballs your way. He does get a buff once he shrinks to gain speed over time, making him harder to hit as the fight goes on. That's a cool thought and all, but after he shrivels up, it only takes 2 hits of the magic sword to make him pop. This eliminates any fear of him actually getting a chance to gain speed, instead you just tank and bang him. Overall, it's a solid prototype for those item-centric boss fights, and I'm sure those who didn't find the old man were left scratching their heads at this seemingly invincible skin tag. But once you discover its weakness, this fight is cake. Only it's 2-week-old stale cake that someone ate all the frosting off of, and it's the only thing on the menu until the next dungeon. Number 6, Dodongo. Well, let's see. Old man, do you have any idea what this one's weakness is? Smoke, huh? I wonder if we have an item that can make some of that. What do you think, Link?
Great! I can't wait to bomb some Dodongo!
My boy!
That's the fucking spirit. If only this fight actually lived up to that level of enthusiasm. Dodongo waltzes around the map in a predictable pattern. Your job? You've been hired to feed that Triceratops some bombs. Simply leave one in his path and he'll eat it, no questions asked. After it blows up in his stomach, half killing him, it must have caused somehow some severe brain damage because the poor sap goes back in for seconds. That's it. 1-2 kaboom! He's dead. His only method of harming you is to bump into you. It's not any sort of threat, but you might end up getting in trouble if he takes a bad turn away from your bomb and you have a low stock. Still, if your intensity is based on the probability of him turning away from a bomb, that's the kind of tension that would rival your average bingo night. Dodongo gets the nod over Digged Auger because his usage of items actually requires you to take an active role and strategically drop bombs in his path. In other words, at least this one requires effort. Number 5, Goma. And so our evolution of effort continues, this time with the old man's tip of aiming at the eyes of Goma. This could really only mean two things, either be full health and fire off a sword beam or shoot it in the eye with an arrow. It's much more likely he's implying arrows, so take aim, and that was it? A single arrow? Well, that was a disappointment to say the least. Here, let's try that again.
Relax. Do not think of it as an animal. It is simply a target. Clear your mind. Steady your aim and breathe in. Feet solid. Steady yourself. Exhale and release.
I mean, that's the least you could have done, Nintendo! In reality, this fight should take many more arrows to actually down the spider, a simple correction that would have gone a long way. To their credit, there are Gomas later that take multiple hits, but why not this initial one? It's a great concept that gives variety from using the sword, but they should have taken that next step to make the fight a little bit more lengthy. The only reason he finds himself above Dodongo is that he actually fights back. So far, the bar has been set at popping an anus with a flute, causing explosive indigestion with no resistance, and eye jousting. We can only go up from here. Number 4, Aqua Mentis. You would think that with how basic the bosses have been so far, Aqua Mentis would be a mid-game boss, but no, those are actually all mid-game bosses with the exception of Dodongo, and Aqua Mentis is the first boss you face in the game. As such, he's not a complex battle at all. There's no puzzle to speak of, you just get in close and smack him with your sword, or leave a bomb, your choice. With him being the introductory fight, it makes sense for it to be straightforward. It's the first time you've faced off against a big monster, you likely haven't found many, if any, heart containers, and you're probably still using the wooden sword. I think Nintendo designed this fight with these things in mind, which is great design. That said, once you know how to beat Aqua Mentis, it's just as easy as any of the other bosses on our list. You walk up and smack him a handful of times with your sword if you're being brave. If you're being efficient, you can smack him 2 to 3 times and then drop a bomb to kill him, or if you really want to take advantage, just chill in the back and toss sword beams at him. That final strategy puts you at a huge advantage because the boss only has one attack. It scoots up and down and fires 3 fireballs in an arc. With this being a top-down game, your method of evasion is positioning yourself on the screen with good timing to avoid hits. For Aqua Mentis, being at a distance is better because the further out you are, the more the fireballs spread out. No matter how you handle it though, Aqua Mentis is an appropriate first boss challenge for a new player and a proper doormat for everybody else. Number 3, Gliac. In many ways, this boss feels like an evolved take on Aqua Mentis. Whereas Aqua Mentis is a slow-moving horizontal fight with a set pattern of attack, Gliac is a vertical fight that has its heads moving instead of its body, and its attacks fire off a bit more randomly. When you first fight Gliac, you'll only have 2 heads, but you do face off against 3 and 4 head variants later on. No matter how many heads, the win condition is always the same. Cut off all the heads and claim victory. The catch and extra wrinkle in difficulty is that when you cut off a head, it begins floating around and firing extra fireballs at you. This adds an extra pressure to the fight as it goes on that none of the other bosses so far on this list have, and I think that added difficulty is something to celebrate. I think it can be argued because of this that the fights with more heads are more satisfying and intense, but I also think it's fantastic that they progressively add a head each time you face off to let you get used to the fight with less going on at first, and then slam you with fireballs and heads all over the place and trust that you've adapted. For those reasons, Gliac is a great advancement on Aqua Mentis and well deserving of a spot in the top half of the list. Number 2, Manhandla. Alright, as we're moving on, I'm considering that when it comes to boss fights in this particular game, I'm more biased toward those that expect more out of you in terms of combat. And I think that's a fair stance to take. The puzzles are so simplistic in this game that they can't really compare to the satisfaction you get from the rush of battle. Manhandla is the epitome of a rush. I mean that literally. To slay this beast, you have to cut off the heads in a similar fashion to Gliac. However, rather than have his heads fly around, he instead gets a speed boost for each head lost. And by the time he only has 1 head left, he's darting around the arena like a ping pong ball. This is thrilling to overcome and also balanced well on 2 accounts. First, it only takes 2 sword strikes to destroy a head. Second, if you're great with bombs, you can destroy a bunch of heads in a single blow. But it isn't quite that easy. He'll still spew a ton of fireballs at you which can come seemingly at random, and since evasion is based entirely on your placement at a given time, his constant movements throws an extra layer into the mix that makes this battle one to remember. But as I'm sure you all expected, there's only one boss in this game that has gone on to have eternal recognition in this series. And the number 1 best boss in The Legend of Zelda, Ganon. Building off what I just spoke on, an element of randomness adds to the depth of your consideration of where you're gonna place Link at a given time. This makes you think harder than stab, 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 oh, I won. Well, Ganon is a bit of both. You'll definitely need to be mindful of where fireballs are coming from, but at the same time, Ganon almost requires you to stab wildly. He only unveils himself for a brief moment after he's been hit. Otherwise, you just keep stabbing into the dark at the source of the fireballs hoping to hit the beast. How easy or difficult you find Ganon will be based on the resources that you bring along. If you've gotten all the best best gear, you're probably not going to be breaking a sweat here. If you're coming in with a wooden sword and no armor, first of all, I'm impressed that you made it this far, and second, unless you are the pro that you must be, you're about to get teabagged by some piggy balls. The final bit of damage is done by the advice of an old man who said secret power is held within the silver arrows. So once Ganon turns brown, you know he's vulnerable, one shot with the arrow, and he turns to dust. In some ways, I would argue that this fight is anticlimactic in terms of challenge, but from another perspective, I'd like that you actively choose how hard the fight will be based on what upgrades you go for over the course of your playthrough. It's also the only fight in this game with any real stakes behind it. All the rest of the fights have had you going for a piece of the Triforce, which is nice and all, but the whole point of getting the Triforce was to slay Ganon and save the princess. I can't even imagine how triumphant it felt back in the day when Nintendo Power and word of mouth from friends were the only sources of guidance you had to make it through this cryptic iteration of Hyrule. It's a kind of adventure that is difficult to perfectly replicate these days. As such, The Legend of Zelda is a game that will be treasured by many as one of the best games of all time, and it certainly has some amazing bosses for that time as well. What I want to know is what you think. Who are your favorite and least favorite Legend of Zelda bosses? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like. It means a lot to me to know you're enjoying the content. And if you want to stay up to date on all the latest from my channel, be sure to subscribe. I want to thank you all for watching today. Much love to you, and I'll see you in the next video.